Pentacon has a somewhat complicated history going back to post-World War II and the division of Germany into the eastern or into the western and eastern zones. At that time, there were two Zeiss Icon companies. One was in the western zone, controlled by the US and its allies, and one was in the eastern zone, controlled by the Soviet Union and its allies. Both laid claim to the Zeiss Icon name. There's a much longer story involved, but eventually it ended up in, I believe, an international court where West German Zeiss Icon was awarded or given the rights to the name Zeiss Icon. The East German Zeiss Icon operation was then renamed Pentacon. Pentacon was the umbrella company for a number of German camera brands, including Praktica, Exacta, Exa, Pentacon, of course, itself, Ergonomics, and several others. I'm sure somebody will be able to provide a more thorough understanding of the Pentacon company. Suffice to say, Praktica was one of its camera lines and probably was the most successful, commercially successful as far as appealing to camera buyers outside of the Eastern bloc of countries or outside of the Soviet bloc. The Praktica MTL5 was produced from 1983 to 1985. What's important about this model is that it arrived at a time when the Japanese camera industry had largely abandoned the screw mount, the 42mm screw mount. And that was of course led by Pentax, which was a big user of the screw mount camera with its very popular Spotmatic line. Nearly all Japanese, in fact, we can just say within a few years, all Japanese camera makers abandoned the 42mm screw mount in favor of a proprietary bayonet mount, which was quicker and also provided open aperture metering, which by that time was not only in wide use, but was expected by photographers. East Germany was the lone holdout, and even East Germany eventually bowed to the will, so to speak, of the market and unveiled some bayonet mount cameras. Pentacon had released a Praktica model, the B200, in 1979, and it was the first to use a bayonet mount camera. However, as I mentioned, it continued to produce screw mount cameras for several more years, and not finally ending production of those cameras until 1989. And by that time, autofocus cameras were beginning to take over the amateur market and eventually the professional market as well. When it was released in the early 1980s, it was still behind the times, especially when compared with a lot of the electronic features and modernization of cameras that had taken place in the Japanese camera industry. So, for example, this still used stop-down metering. By 1983, stop-down metering for photography was a distant memory. Even West German cameras had done away with it. This was a fully manual camera with speeds running from 1/1000th down to 1 second plus B. This did have a built-in meter, and battery goes here. I believe this was a CDS meter, and I'm going to guess from the size of this particular battery cover that this was a 625 cell. I believe those were still available in the early 1980s, but let's take a quick look. That does look like the size of a 625 cell. Well, let's take a look. Check it out. Yep. So that'll be for a 625. That'll be for a 625 mercury cell. You probably could get away with using a hearing aid battery in an O-ring, or possibly, I'm not sure if you can use just a standard LR44 or S76. You might be able to. The voltage difference, I don't know if these cameras compensated for that voltage difference. Some cameras did and some cameras did not. So while we're looking at the bottom of the camera, you'll notice this is the tripod mount. And obviously the tripod mount is here because you couldn't put it up here. Well, I guess you could move it to the side, but they didn't. Here's your rewind button. The bottom plate is otherwise clean. There's no ability to accept the motor winder, obviously. Taking a look at the rest of the top deck, you have a hot shoe, you have your foldable rewind crank, and frame counter, and your film advance. This was a single stroke film advance, meaning that you could not wind it in small increments. And if you notice, even if you let that go, it does not ratchet, so your winding motion will pick up where you left off. Let's take a quick look, see what kind of shutter this uses. This uses a vertically traveling metal blade shutter. No surprise here, film runs traditionally from left to right. These are your film rails, and here's your pressure plate. Let's move that over here. Here's your pressure plate. There's a little spring here to keep the film cartridge in place, keep it from rattling around. Now, of course, the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against the film rails, so when you take your photo, it will record as sharp as image as possible, and that, of course, is always dependent upon the lens being of sufficient quality to record a sharp image. There's nothing really remarkable about the inside of the camera. This uses a self-resetting frame counter, which means when you open the back, the frame counter resets to 0. And by now, that was expected. You have your eyepiece on the back. This camera uses a very traditional match needle system with a plus, a minus, and a 0 in the center with a needle that floats up and down. Your self-timer is here. Activating the self-timer should give you about a 10-second delay. This, as I mentioned, this is stop-down metering. When you are metering your scene, you would pull this lever toward the body with your index finger. It's going to stop the lens down. And so then you would either adjust your aperture or your shutter speed until the indicated exposure was correct. As was very common for many cameras, your film speed setting was inset into the shutter speed dial. And so you lift and rotate the outer collar to change film speeds. Film speeds are marked both in ASA and DIN. Today, ASA is equivalent to ISO. The lens is the Pentacon Auto 1.8. This is the 1.850, and that would indicate that it's a planar type lens. I haven't seen the actual lens design, but very likely that's what it is. It's probably going to be a planar type, which means you're going to get a very sharp photo. As I mentioned, this is a screw mount lens. And like many screw mount lenses, this had both an A and an M switch. The A meant that the aperture was automatic and was actuated by this pin. The M meant that it was always closed down to whatever aperture you had set on the aperture collar. When you look at this camera, so if you notice, this lever pushes forward this small flap here. This flap pushes this pin, which then closes the lens down to the indicated aperture. So when you take a photo and release a shutter, you'll notice that it pushes this small piece forward, which closes the lens down. The shutter on this camera is very snappy. I also forgot to mention that the shutter speed has a special indicator right here with a little lightning bolt. Lightning bolt almost always in photography means flash, and generally electronic flash, because we think of lightning as being electric in nature. This camera also has a sync post right here, flash synchronization post. I don't know if this would be set up to use for bulb flash. By that time, amateurs had, for the most part, stopped using bulb flash, so it wouldn't be surprising to find out that it's not actually for bulb flash. But maybe it is. Maybe it is. I don't have the manual for this, so I really can't tell you. In use, this camera is pretty simple to use, although there is a tendency to slightly push this lever as you release the shutter. And you can see how that happens. You probably could, if you wanted to, use your middle finger. I found it just as easy just to use my index finger to release the shutter. As far as as far as having the shutter release right here, it's a little different, right? It's not a terrible setup, but the fact that it's angled does make it a bit easier to release the shutter. As you might know, I'm not a real big fan of front-mounted shutter releases, particularly those you have to physically push down. So this is sort of a compromise. Well, let's take a look and see what this camera weighs. All right, the Praktica MTL5 weighs 1 pound, we could say 1 pound 11 ounces. And so that's closing in on 2 pounds. Not a massive camera, and you know, it doesn't really feel all that heavy. You know, I just happen to have the Argus C3 handy. I think by that time the Argus brick was off the market, but just for fun. Now look at this. This weighs, that's 1 pound 10, 11 ounces, and this weighs 1 pound 11 ounces. So if you think about it, you have two cameras that weigh roughly the same, but obviously this one offers you better functionality as a photographic device. You know, I was going to compare this with the Pentax Spotmatic, but perhaps a better comparison might be with the Pentax K1000. One advantage that this camera had over the Pentax is that this has a split image focusing aid in the viewfinder, whereas the Pentax K1000 still had that circular spot, and same as the Spotmatics. This is a very sturdy SLR. It's as you can see, it's mostly metal. This covering is not it's not like that leather material. This is more of a synthetic, padded synthetic covering. Feels nice under the hands, and it's not bad. You know, it serves its purpose. This camera still holds appeal for those who are just looking for a basic single lens reflex camera. It also would appeal to those who might have a large library or a large collection of screw mount lenses. It also might appeal to the beginning photographer who is just looking for something very simple with no frills. Keep in mind that although it does have a meter, the battery operates only the meter. And so that makes it very similar to the Spotmatic and also to the Pentax K1000, with this holding a slight edge in the fact that it has that split image focusing aid in the viewfinder. One other advantage that this camera has is the absence of foam seals. Being a German camera, the Germans designed what they called a labyrinth back, which blocks the light and didn't require the use of foam or any other type of material to block light in the camera back. That means today there's no need to replace foam seals, and so that's a nice little thing to think about. Obviously, with this camera, it doesn't have a lot of upward growth potential. That is, you know, you're not able to change finders, you're not able to add a motor drive, your choice of lenses is somewhat limited. But for most photographers who select this camera, it's not going to be a huge problem. I think I owned an LTL at one point. I think it was an LTL3. Don't recall what happened. Oh, I know what happened. I sold it. That's what happened. With that camera, it was missing the self-timer lever, which was odd, but I don't know what happened to it. Somebody removed it. But the camera was otherwise in good shape, and I think it came with the same type of lens. And what's really nice about the 42mm screw mount is the fact that you can take so many different lenses. So in addition to that Tessar, now this is a very early Biotar. This is an f2. It's 42mm screw mount once again. And you can tell that it's early because this one has the Carl Zeiss Jena markings on it. So this would have been pre-court case. So there's that lens. That's if you wanted something really a bit higher speed, although that one's f.8 and this one's f2, so it wouldn't make sense to really step down. And then finally, well, not finally, but another option is this lens, which is a Tessar. Now this one's unusual too. This is what's known as the zebra tessar. And you can see why they call it a zebra tessar. It's so named because of the stripes. And so this one also has the Carl Zeiss Jena DDR, which was the nomenclature for East Germany. And this one's marked Tessar, and this is an f2.8. So why would you select a 2.8 lens over a 1.8 lens? Well, pound for pound, the Tessar was always known as being one of the sharpest lenses. I believe Carl Zeiss refers to it as the eagle eye. Although I do have to say that the Pentacon and most planar lenses are very, very sharp. Tessar has its own different optical qualities, and they're pretty well liked. So at some point I found this little Spiritone lens hood. And what's sort of cool is that it really matches the design of this particular lens. So I always keep it on this with this one. Now I believe this lens shade can be used with both, or lens hood. This lens hood can be used with both the 50mm lens and also the 135. This is a 49mm screw mount, as were nearly all of the 50mm lenses that came out of East Germany. So what's nice about that? What's nice about that is you only had to buy one lens shade or one filter, particularly if you were buying some of the other filters, such as a red filter or a green filter or a polarizing filter. You know, you only had to buy one, and then you could share it between your different cameras. So that was something nice. And that's something that has always sort of aggravated me with the Japanese lenses, is that there are so many different filter sizes. So you ended up having to buy, you know, especially when you got into like the specialty filters, like a polarizing filter, to have to buy that over and over and over again was a little bit aggravating. So how would I rate the Praktica MTL 5? I give it an 8.9 overall. I think it does a pretty good job as far as being a photographic tool. There are a couple quirks. One is that angled front-mounted shutter release. It's not a deal breaker, but you know, be aware of it. It otherwise is a very straightforward camera, simple to use. It has all the features that an amateur would need. The Praktica MTL5 is one of those cameras that would be great for a first-time film user. What's nice is that it's an all-manual camera with the battery only providing power for the meter. So that's my take on the Praktica MTL5, which brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, please think about hitting that like and subscribe button. And feel free to leave a comment below or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And I hope to see you on the next video.